Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Jane Austen July video. Today I'm going to be talking about extended family in Jane Austen. So this is the third part in a three-part series about family in Jane Austen. The first video was about parents in Jane Austen and the second about siblings in Jane Austen, so I'll link them down below. But today I'm going to be talking about extended family in Jane Austen. There are going to be no spoilers for Jane Austen books in this video today. Extended family, specifically grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins, are important in Jane Austen, but I would say that in general, with the exception of Mansfield Park, in Jane Austen's novels it is siblings and parents who are the most important family members. I would like to start off by talking about grandparents in Jane Austen. There are not that many grandparents in Jane Austen. None of the central heroes or heroines have grandparents alive. When I first started to think about the role of grandparents in Jane Austen, I was really struggling to think of any grandparents in Jane Austen. Thinking about it a bit more, I have thought of a few, but they're either not important characters or the fact that they're a grandparent isn't important, if you see what I mean. So for example, Mrs. Bates in Emma is Jane Fairfax's grandmother, but Mrs. Bates is quite a background character who is quite quiet and rarely says anything. Mr. Woodhouse in Emma, Emma's father, is a grandparent to the children of Isabella, who's Emma's sister, but obviously Mr. Woodhouse's role in the book is as Emma's father, not as grandfather to Emma's nieces and nephews. Then in Persuasion, Sir Walter Elliot and the Musgroves are grandparents of Charles and Mary Musgrove's children. Mrs. Jennings in Sense and Sensibility is the grandmother of the children of Lady Middleton and Sir John, and the elder de Courcys in Lady Susan have grandchildren who are Mr. and Mrs. Vernon's children. So in general, grandparents are not really important at all within Jane Austen. This is quite interesting. I think it's easy to think that this is a life expectancy thing, but it's not exactly, because yes, the average life expectancy was much lower in the late 18th and early 19th century, but that was because a lot of people died younger due to illness and accident rather than because sort of no one lived above 60 or 70. Lots of Jane Austen's family members, siblings and parents lived into their 70s and 80s. But, you know, I do think it was likely that in the early 19th century, someone of the age of most of Jane Austen's heroines wouldn't have had as many grandparents living as would be likely today. But I also definitely think it wouldn't be a given that they wouldn't have any grandparents living at all. So I do think it's interesting that none of Jane Austen's heroes or heroines have grandparents living. You know, Jane Austen's own mother, who was 78 when Jane Austen died and 88 by the time that she died, lived to see 33 grandchildren born, which is pretty impressive. And by the time Mrs. Austen died, her eldest grandchildren were in their 30s, and she had lived to see some great grandchildren born as well. I wonder if it's partly because Jane Austen didn't know her own grandparents. All four of her grandparents died before she was born. And while I'm not like mega into reading things into books because of the author's life, I do think it's fairly easy to see that Jane Austen wrote a lot about sibling relationships because she knew a lot about sibling relationships, and maybe one of the reasons why she didn't write anything about grandparent-grandchild relationships is because she didn't feel like she knew very much about them, or they weren't of interest to her in the same way that sibling relationships and parent-child relationships and aunt or uncle, niece and nephew relationships were, which we'll talk about in a minute. I think it's also really interesting that all of the grandparents I named earlier, with the exception of Mrs. Bates, is the grandparent to a niece or nephew of a main character. So like the narrative purpose behind them being a grandparent is actually to do with the main character being an aunt. While grandparents are not very important in Jane Austen, aunts and uncles are definitely important in Jane Austen, especially aunts. Jane Austen herself was an aunt. During her lifetime she had 24 nieces and nephews, which is quite a lot. There's a quote from one of her letters that I really enjoy, which is, "I have always maintained the importance of aunts," and her and her sister Cassandra took their role as aunts to their nieces and nephews very, very seriously and had really close relationships with a lot of their nieces and nephews. There are lots of letters surviving between Jane Austen and her nieces and nephews. So like I said, I'm not, in general, massively wonderful reading things about the author's life into their books, but you can tell from Jane Austen's letters that she really liked being an aunt and she loved her nieces and nephews. So I feel like you can see the importance that aunts and uncles, but especially aunts, play in her books as to do with that. Because as the quote says, she had always maintained the importance of aunts, and the importance of aunts is definitely maintained in her novels. And in the course of her books, we have heroines with aunts and uncles, and also heroines who are aunts themselves. In Pride and Prejudice, aunts and uncles are hugely important. Look at the role of Mrs. Phillips in the neighbourhood and how much of the Bennet girls' society and social set is influenced by her. Look at Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and their really important role in the plot, as well as kind of better parent figures to Elizabeth and Jane than they have in their own parents. And look, of course, at Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is another very, very important aunt figure within the novel. In many ways, like, Lady Catherine and the Gardiners drive the plot along a lot, especially in like the second half of the novel. They are quite instrumental in the plot, which I think is really interesting because they are these sort of important aunt and uncle figures within the novel. And obviously we have kind of a very positive aunt and uncle figure within the Gardiners and a very, very negative aunt figure within Lady Catherine de Bourgh. In Mansfield Park, aunts and uncles are hugely at the fore. I would say Mansfield Park is the novel of all Jane Austen's which is most focused on more extended family than like immediate family, because Fanny Price is brought up by her aunts and uncles and cousins. Fanny Price is raised by her aunt and uncle Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram and her other aunt Mrs. Norris. They're not the best of aunts and uncles to Fanny, and they don't look after her very well. Mrs. Norris is absolutely horrible and truly oppressive towards Fanny Price. Sir Thomas mostly isn't very aware of her, and then we also have Lady Bertram, who means well, really cares about Fanny, but is just a hopeless aunt figure in many ways, does not know how to help Fanny, does not know what's best for her, is sort of very dismissive and very indolent, and kind of lives in her own little world a lot of the time, not really understanding what's going on around her, not really having much interest in what's best for her children, and certainly not what's best for her niece. But it's interesting that it's not just in family as well that aunts and uncles are important, because the Crawfords, who are sort of the opposite to Fanny Price in many ways, Mary and Henry have also been raised by an uncle, by their uncle the Admiral, after their parents died. So they have also been brought up by an uncle rather than a parent. So we have that kind of opposition between Fanny and Henry and Mary, where both of them have been raised by uncle/aunts, and kind of how that affects their characters in very, very different ways. In many ways, Fanny Price has become sort of more and more insular because of the tyrannical behaviour of her aunt Mrs. Norris, whereas the Crawfords have become sort of more and more wild because their uncle has set them a bad example. In Persuasion and Emma, our main characters themselves are aunts. Anne Elliot is an aunt and loves her sister Mary's children very much and is a good aunt to them. And Emma Woodhouse too is a good aunt. She loves her sister Isabella's children, and in fact Mr. Knightley and her are often brought together by the children who they are aunt and uncle to respectively, because their siblings are married. And there's at least one point in Emma where Emma and Mr. Knightley are having a bit of an argument, and one of their nieces kind of sat between them, and they end up sort of making up over their shared involvement in their niece. And also in Emma we have another important aunt figure who is Miss Bates, who is aunt to Jane Fairfax, one of the other main characters. And Miss Bates is a really interesting character in many ways. I don't always think that she is the best at kind of looking after Jane and knowing what's best for her. She spends a lot of time talking to people about Jane when Jane is very reserved and shy and probably wouldn't enjoy that. But at the same time you see her complete love for Jane, and also how like Jane's future is the driving force of Miss Bates' life. Miss Bates is constantly talking about Jane Fairfax, constantly reading her letters over and over again, and to everyone who comes nearby, because Jane Fairfax is what she lives for, and Jane Fairfax is the person for whom she has like built her life around, which I think is really touching. It's really interesting that Miss Bates is one of the very few old maid figures who feature in Jane Austen's novels, but also she is the only like maiden aunt figure who appears in all of Jane Austen's books, I think, which is quite interesting because obviously Jane Austen herself was a maiden aunt, as it were, who was unmarried and who thought a lot about her nieces and nephews and loved them a lot. So I do think it's quite interesting that Miss Bates, who is this sort of comical character, had a role in society that Jane Austen occupied herself. And obviously I think it's significant as well in Emma that Miss Bates, while not Emma's aunt, is another main character's aunt and an important aunt figure who moves the plot along. Another way in which aunts and uncles sometimes feature in the novels of Jane Austen is to be there to provide an inheritance of some kind, or you know, young men especially waiting on an inheritance from an aunt and uncle. So for example, Frank Churchill in Emma is due to inherit from his aunt and uncle at some point in the future, and Mr. Willoughby in Sense and Sensibility is also also kind of waiting on an inheritance or hoping for an inheritance from his aunt. So aunts and uncles definitely play a really important role in Jane Austen's novels, and especially aunts, I would say. And we definitely have sort of good and bad and in between aunts in Jane Austen's work. We have pretty awful aunts like Mrs. Norris or Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and then we also have good aunts like Mrs. Gardiner, and we have well-meaning but not always quite doing the right thing aunts like Miss Bates or Lady Bertram. And now let's talk about cousins. So there are lots of cousins featuring in Jane Austen's books. I will say that in the modern day, when we say cousin, we usually mean first cousin, and in the 18th and 19th century that wasn't the case at all, and cousin was a like loose catch-all term for any kind of cousin. So some of the cousins that are mentioned about in Jane Austen are first cousins, you know, two people who have parents who are siblings, but quite a lot of the other cousins in Jane Austen are more distant cousins. So let's start off with cousins in Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Collins is obviously quite an important person in Pride and Prejudice. He is not a first cousin of the Bennets, but he is a cousin of some kind, but we know he is the next male in line. So because Longbourn is entailed, it will go to Mr. Collins after Mr. Bennet's death, and Mr. Collins therefore comes to the house with the aim of marrying one of his cousins in order to make amends, and you know, everything goes on from there. Mr. Collins is ridiculous and silly and very, very funny. He's a very entertaining character, and his role sort of within the Bennet family, within the future of Longbourn, and his role in the story is quite important as well. Of course, we also have the cousins Mr. Darcy and Anne de Burgh, and it's quite interesting that like the second section of the story where Elizabeth and Darcy meet is when Elizabeth goes to stay with her cousin and Mr. Darcy has gone to stay with his. And then another cousin of Mr. Darcy's who is important within the novel is Colonel Fitzwilliam. And it's interesting that both Anne de Burgh and Colonel Fitzwilliam are Mr. Darcy's cousins, but they also have like another relation to Mr. Darcy as well, in that according to Catherine de Burgh and Mr. Darcy's mother, Anne de Burgh and Mr. Darcy will one day get married, and also Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam share guardianship of Mr. Darcy's sister. So they have like a guardianship role jointly as well as being cousins. While in Pride and Prejudice we have the long-lost cousin Mr. Collins, in Persuasion we have the long-lost cousin Mr. Elliot, who is another potential suitor to our heroine and has a very important role within the plot. He is also the heir to the baronetcy of Anne's father, Sir Walter. So there's lots of sort of inheritance and money relations as well as the familial relations going on there as well. And Sense and Sensibility, when the Dashwoods are forced to leave their home, it is Mrs. Dashwood's distant cousin John who offers her a new home and tries to help her. And it's interesting and really lovely, I think, in Sense and Sensibility. You see how much Sir John values family and how important family connections are to him, and how it's really important for him to help Mrs. Dashwood as much as he can because she is family and because they are cousins. And you know, it's very significant in Sense and Sensibility that Sir John, a distant cousin who Mrs. Dashwood barely knows, is the one who helps them, not Mrs. Dashwood's stepson and her daughter's half-brother John Dashwood, who just doesn't really help them at all. It is in fact a cousin rather than a sibling who steps in and helps save the day. Mansfield Park is probably the Jane Austen novel that is the most about cousins. Fanny Price is brought up with her cousins Edmund, Tom, Maria and Julia, all of whom are very important characters and all of whom are very significant within the plot, and you know, the plot is driven often by the actions of her cousins rather than of Fanny herself, who is a bit more pulled back from the action because she is quite shy and quite a passive character in some ways. It's also really interestingly explored in Mansfield Park how Fanny Price is treated differently from her cousins because they are baronet's children and she is the daughter of a struggling naval officer. She is from a very different class background to them, and so although she has been brought up with them, she is treated very, very differently, and they're kept very much as cousins, not as siblings. They're not brought up together in quite the same way, because Fanny Price is always sort of kept separate and kept down, especially by her aunt, Mrs. Norris. She's very, very close friends through the whole of the book with her cousin Edmund. Tom it's a bit more complicated with, and then Maria and Julia she doesn't get on with and doesn't always approve of. It's only really her cousin Edmund who she is friends with. I feel like I need to briefly talk about cousins getting married in the 18th and 19th century. Obviously this feels very weird for modern readers. It was quite common in the 18th and 19th century, quite a lot of people married their first cousins or their broader cousins, and partly it's just because that was the custom and that was considered perfectly fine back then. But I think it was also quite common because some families wanted to sort of keep things fairly close because of the certain class they were. And also I think I touched on this a bit in my video about brothers and sisters in Jane Austen, but because sort of relationships and friendships between everyone, but especially between men and women, were quite kind of constrained by propriety in the 18th and 19th centuries, therefore like the men who women of this class knew best, who weren't their brothers, were their cousins or other people they had some kind of family connection to. Anyway, the final thing I want to talk about in this video is just a little bit about extended family and class. I talked a bit in the video I did about parents in Jane Austen, about how people's parents affect their class, but I also wanted to mention about how extended families affect someone's class. For example, Pride and Prejudice spoiler coming. I know I said this would be spoiler free, but I feel like I need to talk about this properly. In that very important scene between Elizabeth and Lady Catherine that I mentioned in my parents episode, Elizabeth says to Lady Catherine, "He is a gentleman, I am a gentleman's daughter. So far we are equal." And as I spoke about on Monday, I think it's really interesting how it emphasises it's not the fact that Elizabeth is a lady that makes her equal to Mr. Darcy, it's the fact that she is a gentleman's daughter. But Lady Catherine replies, "True, you are a gentleman's daughter, but who was your mother, and who are your aunts and uncles? Do not imagine I am ignorant of their condition." And she says, you know, who are your aunts and uncles, and what matters is the extended family. That has a role to play in class as well. Yes, your class is defined by your parents, but it's also defined by the other people you are related to, and that makes a big difference to your place in the world as well. So I did think that was just worth talking about here. And obviously I've already mentioned a little bit about aunts and uncles and inheritance. You know, often if someone who has a lot of capital or has an estate does not have sons or children in general of their own, their estate, their fortune will go to the next male relation. So actually certain extended families and certain relations end up having this kind of connection through property and inheritance that actually kind of draws them closer together than blood in some ways, which is quite interesting. Anyway, I think that's all I wanted to say for now. I hope you found this 3-part series on family in Jane Austen interesting. It's been really interesting to make. I love Jane Austen, love looking at her works in lots of different ways. So yeah, do let me know down below in the comments what your thoughts on family in Jane Austen are. And that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.